Boldwood presents The Daughter of the Fens, written by Elena Collins and read by Antonia Beamish. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Norwich, 2006. The instant her head hit the floor, something changed forever. Seconds passed. It took moments for Hannah to open her eyes again, and when she did, she had no recollection of what had happened. Another life flashed before her eyes, a life she didn't recognize as her own, but one that would never leave her. She'd been standing in a line in the gym, waiting her turn, her shoulders relaxed, arms by her sides, chin raised. In her black leotard, she looked exactly the same as any other 13-year-old girl in the competition, lean, muscled, hair neatly tied back. This was the East Anglia area competition. The reward was a place in the finals in London for the best 3 competitors. Hannah had closed her eyes, concentrating. She was ready for this. She had trained hard, perfected every move. An authoritative voice had called out the name of the gymnast before her, a girl with a mass of curly hair who'd hesitated before leaping forward in a sprint, light as air, as her body arced on the trampette, flipping over, landing firmly on the trampoline. She began her display with a perfectly executed pike, a straddle, a precise front and back drop. She was good, Hannah had conceded, a strong rival. Hannah had watched as the girl bounced higher, a slick twist in each somersault, landing confidently, legs slightly bent, arms in the air, finishing an impressive sequence. Hannah took a breath. If she was focused and calm, if she gave her best performance, she could beat her. Hannah knew her mother was watching from the other side of the gym, seated on a bench, nervous fingers folded on her lap, waiting. Stephanie Frampton had driven her all over East Anglia and beyond to gymnastic competitions since Hannah was 9 years old. Her mother was as keen and committed as she was. She'd been divorced since Hannah was 7. There were no other children. Her mother's life revolved entirely around her daughter. Everything was about practicing, eating properly, dedication. Their lives ran like clockwork, a perfect, busy timetable of... Hannah didn't look across. She had to keep her mind on what she was doing. Then someone had called out her name in a crisp voice. "Hannah Frampton!" She had waited a second, controlling her breathing, slowing it down. Then she leaped forward. Hannah had no idea how it happened. One moment she was sailing onto the trampette, then her foot had slipped, or she'd placed it clumsily, she wasn't sure. The trampette hurtled backwards while she was in midair, and an ankle became tangled in the rope of the trampoline. Her body twisted and fell. Her head cracked against the floor. Time passed. Hannah had no idea how long she'd been unconscious. She lay, unmoving. But it was as if she had stood up and entered a dream. Something had changed. She was somewhere else, a place she had never been to before. Yet there was an uncanny familiarity about the surroundings, the open space, the damp grass beneath her feet. Hannah looked around. She was standing in a village, a cluster of smoky huts, tethered animals. Then she was no longer herself. She was another girl. Her clothes were different. She seemed to be dressed in a long tunic, bronze jewellery. Her hair was loose. Over her shoulder, people she recognised were anxious. Faces twisted in shock, angry mouths shouted in warning. An advancing army was snaking across the field towards her. Then there was a noise in her head, the thunder of roars and cries and clashing of metal. For a moment, she was aware of her feet sinking into soft ground, Then a man she instinctively knew she trusted pushed a sword into her hand and shouted in a strange language. Hanna understood in an instant what he meant. He'd told her to stay close. He would protect her. He'd called her another name, not her own. She was shaking, afraid, not listening. The next minute, she was running among a crowd of stampeding tribespeople who were screaming and yelling. A man in steel armour hurled himself towards her, and Hanna's heart churned. She ran the other way, dodging a snarling soldier with a shield. Then a young soldier hovered. He lurched towards her, grabbing her arm. Her eyelids flickered, and her mouth was dry as she spoke. Her lips moved numbly, and she heard her own voice, but the words were mangled. DayWhen. Hanna glanced up. Faces loomed over her and Iceni. She felt a low twinge grip the back of her head, and she closed her eyes again. Later, Hanna sat in the changing room with her mother, who clutched her hand. Hanna was wearing tracksuit bottoms over the leotard now, a sweatshirt wrapped around her shoulders for comfort and warmth. She was confused. "Mum?" Her mother's face was anxious. "Your foot slipped. Apparently there's not a mark on you, but you were out cold for a few seconds." "I don't remember." Hanna had been left with a strange feeling, her emotions bruised, the sense of a devastating change having happened. "You said something, but it made no sense. And you still seem to be in shock. I'm sure you're fine, Hanna, but I want to take you to A&E to get you checked over." Hanna put a hand to her head. "I'm not sure where I am." She recalled the thunder of battle, soldiers with raised swords rushing around her, the scent of the grass as she fell. "I think we should take you to see a doctor." Hanna stood on shaky legs. "I was somewhere else. I was trying to run away." Hanna's mother smiled, reassuring. "Let's get you home via the hospital, shall we?" For a moment, Hanna didn't move. The word home was a difficult word to process. She wasn't sure where home was. She knew the name Little Rhymer, the village where she lived, not far from King's Lynn, number 32 Moorkin Close. But it wasn't home. She closed her eyes and saw fields, mist, wide skies. The smell of something burning was in her nostrils, the smoky hut, the cooking pot over the fire. She moved her lips, but no words came. Then her mother was helping her to stand, an arm beneath hers, guiding her to the doorway, clutching her sports bag. Hanna couldn't feel her trainers touch the floor, but her feet moved by themselves. Her mind wasn't her own. There was still a humming behind her eyes, the sound of people shouting, a sense of panic, and she shook her head to see if the noise would go away. But the worst thing was the turbulent emotions hammering inside. The anxiety, the fretfulness, the sense that she should be trying to escape, fighting for her life, not following her mother to the car, not leaning back against the headrest, eyes closed, listening to the skirmish raging inside her head. Her mother was calling her name. "Hanna? Hanna, can you hear me?" "Sorry," Hanna mumbled. Strangely, she still thought of herself as the girl in her dream. She saw the concern etched around her mother's eyes and tried to respond. "I'm fine." Hanna took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "Fine. Really." "We'll pop in to A&E. I want to make sure you're all right. After all, there's another competition next month, and I don't want you taking part if you're not well enough. That was quite a tumble you took. You gave us all a scare. It's not like you, Hanna. I'm wondering if you're coming down with something, A bug, perhaps. I was sure you'd win today. You've worked so hard for this, everyone said. Hanna wasn't listening, but she was aware of the disappointment in her mother's tone. She closed her eyes again. An image had frozen itself in her imagination. The teenage girl who was her, but yet not her. She wore a brightly coloured woolen tunic, a bronze torque. She knew the word, although she'd never heard it before, around her neck. Her hair was loose and tangled. The way she moved was wilder, free. It was Hanna, but it was someone else too. Someone desperate. The young woman was running, although Hanna wasn't sure whether she was dodging away from someone or hurtling towards them. She felt so many emotions, as strongly as if they were happening to her now. The lurch of her heart, the squeeze of fear, the crushing rush of shock that someone was chasing her, hurling her to the earth, dragging her arm, lifting her over a wide shoulder as she watched the earth spin. Although her mother was still talking, Hanna couldn't hear. She was in the car. Her mother was stopping, speaking loudly, clambering out, tugging her arm. They were walking towards a white building, a brick hospital behind it, and into a waiting room, where Hanna stared at blank walls. Time passed, but the voices continued to repeat in her brain. She could still see people throwing themselves forward, sounds of clashing and shouting, screams, more people falling. Then a woman in a white coat was talking to her, and Hanna was replying. Her mouth was moving, and the woman was... It was all very vague, as if Hanna wasn't yet awake. Then she was back in the car again, staring at her hands. Her shoulders ached, as if something heavy was lodged between them. Her mother muttered, "That's good news. Just mild concussion, apparently. Nothing to worry too much about, but I'll keep an eye, like the doctor said." Hanna nodded. She wanted to stop the buzz of her mother's voice. There was too much going on inside her own head for her to reply. Then her mother touched her cheek, gently, a gesture of affection and concern, and said, "You need to rest. The doctor said you should lie down for a while. Let's get you home, love. You'll be better after a good night's sleep." Hanna sighed, offering a single mumbled word. But her mother was wrong. Sleep wouldn't make things better. From this moment onwards, the dreams would start. Nothing would ever be the same. Norfolk, AD 47. It was a day like any other, a wide, bright sky spanning the Iceni village. Wood smoke curled from the little huts, and the villagers busied themselves with their crops and animals. Brea was in her 13th summer. She'd been helping her mother, Cartimandua, to weave cloth inside the hut. The coarse fabric was to be dyed blue, a new tunic for her father, Esico. She was excited about making it. Brea loved him especially, and she knew that he'd hug her when she presented it to him. He'd swing her high in his arms and laugh behind his huge beard. Her father was outside in the sunshine now, fashioning a sword. He was the best metalworker in the village. Brea made an excuse to leave the smoke-filled hut, to sit outside in the sharp air and watch him at work. She loved the way he hammered metal with such skill. It would be a good sword with a fine handle. Brea hoped he was making it for her. She was 13 now. She'd learned to wield a sword as well as anyone, and she needed one of her own. She frowned as she recalled the conversations she'd heard around the fireside during the evenings. Brea did not fully understand what the adults were talking about, but everyone agreed that the Iceni king, Antidios, was right to be suspicious of the Romans, the strange invaders who'd arrived years ago with their Emperor Claudius. people from far away with their own language and new ways, building settlements of their own. Her father had said they wanted to change everything, to take away the traditions of the Iceni people. Their king did not trust them. He did not want to trade with them, and he had no intention of meeting their recent demand to throw away their weapons. Esiko's expression had been determined as he'd swigged mead flavoured with meadowsweet. They must make more arms, not less, for when the inevitable happened. The Romans would come to the villages with their armour and their swords, and they, the Iceni tribe, would be ready to protect their families and their homes. Brea thought about her father's words again as she stared over the flatlands into the distance. Several people were working in the fields, digging up cabbages for tonight's broth. There would be chicken for dinner too, Brea's favourite. Her mother's voice reached her ears, calling her back to work. There were vegetables to prepare in the hut. Brea called cheerily, "I'm on my way." She stood up, stretching her lean limbs. Then something caught her eye. It was a wink of light, metal, gleaming in the sunshine. She gazed towards a distant clump of trees beyond the fields and saw a square formation of men marching towards them. It took Brea a moment to take it in before she gasped. Then her feet were moving towards her father. She was shaking her arm and pointing. She saw her father's expression change, his eyes widen, and he raised the sword and called a warning to the other families. The scurrying started almost immediately. The Iceni were moving, ready to fight. Children were hurried into huts, while men and women reached for swords, sticks, anything they could use to defend the village. Brea watched as the Roman soldiers pushed forwards across a field. At first, small in the distance. Then she could see details, the close formation, as if they were one body of many men, their steps rhythmic. Bronze helmets encased their faces, row upon row of impenetrable masks, each man with a gleaming red and yellow shield on his arm. The soldiers seemed to grow larger, like giants, and Brea watched them, frozen. Iceni tribesmen and women shouted fierce cries of warning. Then her father pushed a sword into her hand and said, "Stay close to me, Brea. I'll protect you." Her mother was standing tall on the other side of her, breathing heavily, clutching a sword, muttering a prayer to Andred, the warrior goddess. Brea noticed the wild. The Iceni people from the village had gathered round them. They began to stamp their feet, warriors preparing for battle, and Brea did the same, her teeth bared, her eyes narrowed. There was a huge roar, then a clash of metal. Brea rushed forward, screaming as loudly as she could, her feet running on the muddy ground. There were harsh cries, the crashing of sword against armour, the sickening lurch of bodies sinking to the ground. Seconds later, she was hurled onto the earth, dragged by her arm, lifted over a wide shoulder, and she watched the earth spin beneath her. She hit her head and was dazed for a moment. A young soldier raised her in his arms. She was his prize. He shouted at her in a strange language. She leaped up at him, trying to kick and bite. He shoved her down roughly and turned away, as if she was of no consequence. There were others of her tribe huddled next to her, men, women, children. They were surrounded by soldiers who pointed swords, guarding them, herding them to their feet. They were prisoners now, slaves of the Romans. Nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 1. The Present Day. Hanna stood at the entrance to Guangzhou Baiyun International Airport, a heavy backpack between her shoulders, a bulky case at her feet. She moved forward to gaze up at the arrivals and departures board. After 4 years of teaching in the international school, her contract had ended, and she needed something new. She was going home, to Little Rhymer in Norfolk. Above her, a tannoy echoed, a nasal voice giving new departure information. Passengers were urged to go to gate 16. There was the bustle of busy people, the hubbub of chattering, but Hanna felt calm. Being in China had meant that the voices in her head had quietened over the past few years. The dreams were less frequent. The rushing images that had been her constant companions as a teenager and at university, and afterwards when she had taught modern languages in a secondary school in Thetford, had almost stopped now. Working in Guangzhou had been a good idea. It had been fascinating, all-consuming. But now, at almost 30 years of age, Hanna was ready for change. She had no idea what she'd do, but she'd take her time. She had savings. Perhaps she'd go back to education, do a master's. Or maybe she'd take a job as a waitress in a cafe in King's Lynn and just settle for a quiet life for a while. Now things were going to be so different back home. Her mother's wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks' time. She hadn't even met her mother's fiancé yet. Patrick Palmer, he was called. Hanna couldn't help her grin. Her mum was going to marry Farmer Palmer, who owned a big farm just outside Little Rhymer, with acres of arable land and droves of British saddleback pigs. Hanna's mum was almost 60 now. She'd found it difficult being on her own once Hanna left the UK. She'd been lonely at first, texting every day, but after much coaxing from Hanna, she'd sorted herself out with a dating app and started to meet new people. Then she'd met the love of her life, almost on her own doorstep. In the video calls, she talked of very little else but wedding plans and how she baked apple pies in the farmhouse kitchen and coaxed the hens to lay. Her mum deserved some happiness. She and Hanna's father had divorced over 20 years ago, and she'd devoted herself to Hanna ever since. Hanna recalled sadly how her father had always been focused on his career. A captain in the Navy, he'd had little time for family. He sent money, visited on occasions, but he lived in Bangkok with a new wife and daughter. He and Hanna hardly spoke now. It was Hanna's mum who'd always been there for her. Stephanie Frampton had shared her passion for gymnastics. Then, after Hanna gave up at 13, her mother had quickly adapted to her fascination for learning languages, even though she didn't speak a word of French or German or Spanish herself. When Hanna had achieved a languages degree at the University of East Anglia, her mother had been so proud. She'd rarely put herself first for all the years of Hanna's growing up. Then, 2 years ago, she'd met Patrick Palmer. Hanna was looking forward to getting to know him properly. Saying hello on a video call had told her nothing, except that he seemed jolly and pleasant, his arm protectively around his wife-to-be. Hanna's eyes flickered to the information board. The flight to Heathrow would leave in 2 hours. She'd get back late tomorrow night. She'd meet her mum at the station, and they'd drive back to Bramblewood Farm, where there would be a room for her as long as she needed one. Hanna made her way forwards. She planned to check in, go through security, then she'd grab a coffee and relax for a while. It felt good to be going home. It was a new chapter of her life, and she was ready to embrace it. 2 hours later, Hanna flopped down in the window seat on the plane and stretched her leg, wondering what her mother would make of the new cut. Her mother had always loved brushing her hair, plaiting it or putting it in a ponytail. The pixie style was neat and suited her. It was practical, no nonsense, cute, and a little bit sassy. She liked it. Hanna gazed through the window and wondered what in-flight film she should choose. She closed her eyes and imagined arriving in Little Rhymer, if much had changed over the last 4 years. Her mother had said in their last video call that lots of new houses were going up, expensive red brick ones with gravel drives. She'd commented that she didn't know where all the money was coming from. Hanna couldn't help smiling. Her mum had moved from the 3-up, 2-down terrace to a grand 7-bedroom farmhouse just outside the village, and the wedding was going to be lavish, no expense spared. Hanna was looking forward to it. She felt someone take a seat next to her, the light sinking of another body into the adjoining seat. Hanna kept her eyes closed, and at that instant an image of a terrified girl running across marshland flashed across her mind. She was there again, clutching a sword, dodging soldiers, the sound of fighting all around her, the intense feeling of panic, of needing to find safety. Hanna opened her eyes and caught her breath. She'd experienced the dreams and flashbacks much less frequently since she'd arrived in China, yet the image was back again, the moment she sat on the plane to go home. She turned to see a small woman watching her. She was dark-haired, greying, tiny inside a pale coat, the twist of an enigmatic smile on her face. Hanna couldn't have guessed her age. Her skin was smooth. There was wisdom and calmness in her eyes. She might be 40, she might be 70. It was hard to tell. The woman's gaze was level. "You are travelling back home?" "I am." Hanna wasn't sure how to reply. "I have a son in London, in Soho. He owns a restaurant, the Zen Cafe. Have you heard of it?" "I haven't." "My name is Song Yu. You may call me Yu. My name means moon." The woman inclined her head. "What may I call you?" "Hanna." "Hanna is a name that travels throughout many different cultures. To me, it means flower," Yu said quietly. "It's a good name for you. A blue flower, like the ones that grow in the English woodlands every year in spring." "Bluebells?" Hanna wondered if she should say something polite, take out her book and immerse herself in reading. She didn't want to be rude, but she wasn't feeling like a conversation with another passenger who had her cornered. Yu seemed to know her thoughts. "It is many hours until we reach Heathrow. I am glad of your company. This will be a long journey, but it will be an interesting one," Yu said. "Exactly as your life will be." Then she closed her eyes, just at the point that she had Hanna's full attention. Yu meditated for several minutes as the plane accelerated along the runway and heaved into the air. Hanna's head was buzzing with thoughts about what Yu had said to her, about her life, her journey. She told herself it was just a flippant, throwaway remark that anyone could have said about anyone. But she recalled Yu's intense eyes, the wisdom that lay behind them. She gazed out at the ground below, the small houses, the diminishing squares of fields. Then she relaxed in her seat and closed her eyes as a dream tugged her. Hanna was in a building with columns, tall white posts that were decorated ornately. It was a temple, a place of worship. She could smell incense, something sweet hanging in the air. There was a feeling of nervousness, her hands shaking. She had the strong sense that she shouldn't be there. Then she saw the reason why. Many men were lifting stones, ironstone or flint, and building the steps, the floors. While they worked, they were goaded and scourged with whips. Other men with harsh voices urged them on, sometimes with a kick to the stomach if they stopped to catch their breath. Hanna was looking for someone she loved, someone she'd known all her life, and the feeling of loss and loneliness became more intense. The heavy scent of incense was replaced by something stronger, burning, the smell of destruction. She saw orange flames leaping and heard rising screams. People were trapped, their voices rising with the curling smoke. "Hannah, you were dreaming?" Hanna nodded. "These dreams have stayed with you for a long time?" "Some of them." Hanna was mystified by the question, but she searched for the right words. "While I was working in Guangzhou, they stopped for a while, but now they've started again." "You are going home, to the place where they began." Hanna nodded again, wondering how Yu knew so much. Then she said, "I don't know why I have them, but it's like I am somewhere else, as if I'm somebody else." "The visions began when you allowed them to come in. They will end when you find what you must find." "And what is that?" Hanna asked without thinking. "You are connected to someone who is now in the shadows." Yu's expression was serious, but without emotion, as if what she was saying was quite normal. Hanna shuddered. "What does that mean?" "Someone else is searching, just as you search. She has long been gone, but she is not at rest, and you are not able to rest until it is finally resolved." Hanna hugged herself. Yu's words had unsettled her. "What do I need to resolve?" "You will know when it is time. Until then, you and she remain connected." Hanna heard the desperation in her own voice. "Who is she?" Yu did not answer. Hanna was unsure if she had heard her speak. She thought about asking again. Instead, she said, "What shall I do?" This time, Yu smiled. "She will let you know." She turned away, staring at the space in front of her. Hanna had the impression that Yu did not wish to be asked anything more, but she couldn't help herself. "Why me? Why do I have these dreams? I mean, is it reincarnation? Is this person me in a former life? The dreams are very vivid, so it could be. Or am I being haunted? I've often wondered about it." So many questions, Hanna. But the answer is simple. Yu put her hands to her. The understanding will come in time. Hanna pressed her lips together to stem further questions. She did not want to be rude, but she was fascinated to know more. She gazed out of the window at the sunlight glinting on the edges of clouds, the vast blue expanse of the sky. There was so much that people couldn't explain. Most likely, her recurring dreams had been caused by the accident she'd had on the trampoline, setting in motion a new activity in her brain, opening the possibility of the vivid imaginings. That was it. Imagination. Of course, she'd never told her mother about the dreams. After her initial disappointment that Hanna had given up gymnastics, Stephanie had been delighted that her daughter was becoming a talented linguist. She'd enjoyed fussing about trips abroad, exchange visits, and extra classes. Hanna saw no point upsetting her. Her mother would only worry, and she had no idea how to explain the strange changes that were happening. Hanna's lids were heavy. She was suddenly tired, her limbs leaden. Sleep took her quickly, and this time she did not dream. Behind her eyes, the azure sky buffeted clouds along as if they were curled lambs, and she slept sweetly. When she woke, a middle-aged man was sitting beside her, squashed in the seat, sipping tea. She could smell the stale tweed of his jacket, a slight whiff of aftershave. Hanna was confused. "Where's you?" The man shook his head and adjusted large-framed glasses, a brief dismissal of her question. Who? The woman who was in the seat next to me. Oh, the man waved a hand. She had the wrong seat. I can't stand sitting at the back of the plane. I told the attendant I'd booked this seat and I jolly well intend to have it. Ah. There was little point Hanna continuing the conversation. You had gone, and with her, any chance of further questions. She'd content herself with her book now. The aroma in her nostrils told her an in-flight meal was being served. Then she'd watch a film. It would all help to pass the time. Hanna pushed the conversation with you from her mind. Soon, she'd be home. Chapter 2. The plane journey had been tiring. Hanna slept fitfully, but by the time she clambered on the train from King's Cross, in less than 2 hours, she'd be standing on the platform in Little Rhymer, hugging her mum. Hannah's head was buzzing with questions about her own new life as she sat in the lurching carriage. How would she feel to be back home? After the daily bustle of China, she'd grind to a halt in the little Norfolk village, but that might not be unpleasant. Hanna had savings. A few months off while she rethought her plans would be a good idea. She'd take up cycling again. The roads were flat, and she could bike to King's Lynn, find a temporary job there until she worked out what to do. It was still August. She might research the master's programmes at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, or she could help her mother settle into the daily routine as a farmer's wife. They could share the chores, cooking, keeping the house tidy, feeding the chickens. Maybe there would be a horse she could befriend. She was sure her mother had said there were 1 or 2 at the farm. The idea of riding a sweet-natured mare every morning appealed to her. Hanna gazed out of the window at the flatlands beyond, feeling the soothing rattle of the carriage. The sun was setting, and a mist was rising over the fens. Water-filled irrigation ditches flashed by, followed by wide fields, shadows lurking over scrubby grasses. She couldn't wait to see her mother again. They'd always been close. They understood each other. Stephanie Frampton seemed to realise that Hannah's choices didn't always need discussing, and Hanna was grateful for her mother's calm acceptance. The day Hanna had left for the teaching job in Guangzhou, tears had gleamed in her mother's eyes, but she'd hugged her and murmured encouragement. The train shuffled into a small country station that was dark and deserted. A few fuzzy lights illuminated the tracks and the exit. Little Rhymer would be next. Hanna felt a little guilty that she'd never mentioned the vivid recurring dreams to her mother, although Stephanie's sharp eyes seemed to notice when she hadn't slept well. The train teetered forwards again. Hanna couldn't wait to see her mum's smile. She wondered what sort of car her mother was driving now she was engaged to Patrick Palmer. What would a farmer's wife drive? The old blue Citroën surely must have been replaced. Stephanie's life had completely changed. There would be an early September wedding. Hanna was excited about sharing plans, being a part of a new family, enjoying her mother's happiness. She'd visited her mother only once throughout the whole time she'd been in China, and suddenly it felt too long. She couldn't wait. There were just a few people now, single travellers in random seats dotted around. One woman was talking quietly on her phone. Another was tapping the keys of a laptop. A man wearing a waistcoat over a striped shirt was almost asleep, his mouth open. Hanna felt the carriage begin to slow. It was drawing into Little Rhymer station. She couldn't help the lightness that lifted in her chest, happy anticipation, a buzz of energy. She stood up, conscious of the aches in her legs. She'd been stuck on a plane since yesterday. She swung her handbag onto one shoulder, heaved her backpack onto the other, and collected her case. The train slowed, grinding to a halt, and Hanna stepped into the Norfolk fresh night air. She gazed around at the old station as the train shuddered away towards King's Lynn. The place was deserted. A hazy light glowed from a single lamp. Night had fallen now, and Hanna could smell sweetness in the air. Honeysuckle. The brick-built station was a murky, mottled colour. Everywhere was closed. The ticket office, the waiting room. A sign hung over a padlocked door. Serenity's Café, with the design of a lotus flower. In the half-light, shadows clung to every corner, and the drop to the tracks below was filled with darkness. Hanna dragged her luggage along towards the bridge and climbed the steps. The only sound was the wheels of her case thrumming on the ground. Overhead, a slice of moon hung in a starless sky. She began to descend the steps to the exit gate, scanning the road ahead for a waiting car. There was none. Hanna caught a slight movement of a woman sitting on a far bench, her head tilted forward. It was past 10 o'clock. There were no more trains tonight. She stared harder. The woman was young, was wearing a thin dress, her hands folded on her knee. It was hard to see the colour of her hair in the darkness, but there was a sheen to it. So it may have been fair. Hanna thought she must feel the cold of the night chill. Although it was summer, the air from the Fens was damp. The young woman seemed sad. Perhaps there had been a family tiff, a break-up with a boyfriend. A sense of solitude surrounded her, an acute loneliness. Hanna wondered if she was in trouble or homeless. She'd go over and ask if she needed a lift somewhere. Her mum wouldn't mind. She reached the bottom. Beyond the gate, bright headlights swerved. A large square car was pulling in, coming to a stop. Hanna glanced back to the bench, but the woman had gone. She looked around, hoping the woman hadn't approached the tracks, but she had disappeared. Suddenly tired, Hanna pushed through the gate towards a large Range Rover and saw her mother's smiling face appear as she wound the window down. She called cheerily, "I brought the biggest car. I thought it would be better for all your luggage. Paddy's busy with paperwork, so it's just me." Then Stephanie slid from the car door, and Hanna was in her arms, inhaling floral perfume, feeling the silkiness of her hair against her cheek, hugging her in a tight squeeze. Her mother held her away. "You're looking well. But, oh, the short hair, Hanna. I can't believe it's so short. I always loved it long." There was a mistiness in Stephanie Frampton's eyes, quickly replaced by a smile. "But it suits you. It's good to see you." Hanna hugged her mother again, conscious that the woman in her arms was a little leaner, her hair lighter, and her clothes very different. She was wearing a wax jacket, jeans, a bright floral scarf. There was a casual smartness to her clothes that had replaced the sensible skirt and blouse she'd always worn. Hanna spoke into her mother's hair. "It's good to see you, Mum." Then she remembered. "Did you see a girl on your way in? A young woman. She was all on her own at the station." "No, no one passed me." Stephanie gripped the handle of her case. "Come on, let's get you home. Have you eaten? I saved some quiche that we had earlier. Paddy hates quiche. He thinks it's a yuppie dish. Of course, there are no yuppies now. Paddy's stuck in the 80s. He likes proper farmer's grub, lots of carbs, like potatoes and pies. I have to watch his waistline for him. I've got him eating pasta for a change. Not so heavy. A nice pesto or a mushroom linguine. That's our compromise. A few healthy carbs and plenty of flavour." Hanna stared at her mother as she heaved Hanna's case into the Range Rover. She was newly galvanised, a sense of purpose to her movements. She'd become a no-nonsense farmer's wife already. A smile on her lips, Hanna wondered briefly if she skinned rabbits for a pot roast. Stephanie was patting her cheek. urging her into the car. "Let's get you home, love. Bramblewood Farm, and Paddy's just dying to meet you. Of course, Oliver is away. He's not back until the weekend." "Oliver?" Hannah was aware Patrick Palmer had a son, but she'd forgotten he lived in the farmhouse. "He does most of the heavy farm work now, all the long hours, but not that Paddy will ever give up farming. He's 67. You'd never think it to look at him, but the farm will go to Oliver. Abby won't want it, although she's the oldest child. Paddy's not at all sexist, of course, but Abby's in Australia. She won't even be back for the wedding. She likes the lifestyle out there too much, hairdressing by day and parties and pools in the evening. No, Ollie is the sensible one." Hannah clambered into the passenger seat as the engine revved, remembering all the information shared on video calls. "Oliver is Paddy's son, and Abby's his daughter in Melbourne." Her mother nodded. "Abby's 35 now, living with an Australian called Holden. Ollie's not married, although he almost was. Then it all went a bit wrong, I think. He lives in the cottage just beyond the farmhouse. You won't see much of him. He works all the time. Paddy suggested he ought to take a few days off, so he's gone to Cambridge for a long weekend at an eco show. It's one of those environmental things. He's very much the eco-warrior, Ollie. He's trying to bring the farm into the modern age." Hannah closed her eyes, listening to the babble of her mum's voice. It was good to hear her sounding so immersed in her new life, but Hannah was tired. It had been a long journey, and suddenly it felt like another new journey was unfolding. She yawned. "Mum, if it's all right with you, I'll just say a quick hi to Paddy, and then I'll go to bed. I'm shattered." She stared through the window at the open farmlands in the dark, the low mist. "Of course, you must be absolutely worn out," Stephanie agreed, "coming all that way from China." "Oh, I do hope you'll be able to settle down here, Hannah. Life will be much slower, of course, but on the farm, no 2 days are the same. And it all changes with the seasons. Ploughing and harvesting. Then there are all the pigs." Hannah rested her head against the glass of the window, her eyelids heavy as the car bumped along the road. She listened to the soothing lilt of her mother's voice, talking about the wedding dress she'd ordered and the ideas she had for what Hannah might wear to the ceremony. They'd go shopping together to pick something nice out, and the reception in the Sprouston Manor Hotel in Little Rhymer was going to be wonderful, and there would be 25 guests for the sit-down. Hannah grunted contentedly. "Sounds great, Mum." Then she was asleep. An hour later, after smiles, shaking Paddy's hand several times, drinking a scalding cup of tea, and refusing any help with her cases, Hannah dragged her luggage upstairs. She fell asleep again almost immediately in her new room beneath a down-filled duvet, surrounded by fresh yellow wallpaper. She drifted into dreams, like sinking into a pillow. She was standing in the servants' quarters of an ancient building, timber and stone capped with a tiled roof, a wide hall with many rooms leading off, courtyards, baths, storage rooms, exercise rooms, orchards and gardens. Her clothes were different, and yet, somehow, they were her own. She wandered into a large dining room with a tiled mosaic floor, and a man wearing a long robe beckoned to her. He was old, with a white beard. His face wasn't unkind, but she was cautious of him. He was powerful. She approached him, and he spoke in Latin, but Hannah could understand him. Volo te epistolam accipere. I want you to take a message. Then Hannah was rushing through an old town, past a river. On one side was a temple, a pale building with tall steps and magnificent pillars. She inhaled the scent of incense. There was someone inside, offering a prayer. There was a tightening ache in her chest, an old anxiety. Then she heard the crack of a whip and looked into the face of a tall man who she recognised. His name was Marcus Rubrius Memnon, and she knew instantly that she didn't trust him. He lived in some sort of training ground, and Hanna knew she needed to go in there. She met his eyes boldly, and he leered back with a mouth blighted with missing teeth. Then she woke up, hot and fretful, staring into absolute darkness, and remembered that she was at Bramblewood Farm. But her heart was thudding hard. She'd left part of herself in the dream, and it would take her a while to become calm again and to remember who she really was. Chapter 3. Camulodunum, AD 60. Brea was working in the culina, the large kitchen close to the servants' quarters, preparing the master's breakfast. Now he was older, his appetite had changed from Each morning, Publius Julius Silvanus would request a wheat pancake with dates and honey. Brea was expected to cut it into small pieces and bring it to him in the triclinium, and he would eat with his fingers, chewing slowly, relishing each mouthful, telling her she was the only slave in the household who knew how to cook a pancake. She hummed quietly, happy in her work, despite the difficulties she faced each day. She was the only Iceni in a villa of Greek and Gallic slaves, although there was Adidamaros, a slave from the Trinovantes tribe who worked in the orchards and gardens, whom she often spoke to when she was passing. Brea had been working in the villa since she was 13, and now, at almost 26, she looked exactly the same as all of the other slave women. They had taken away her Iceni clothes, tamed the wild hair, replaced the colourful tunics and thick mantles, and thrown away her jewellery. She was made to wear her hair pinned up. She wore a simple pale tunic tied at the waist, just as the others did, and she moved on silent feet, her eyes cast down, hoping not to draw attention to herself. It was the only way to survive. Brea's father, Esico, had told her this often as a child. "These are hard times," he'd say. "The Romans are never far from our village, with their eyes on what is ours." And he'd repeat that, come what may, her first duty was to make sure she stayed alive. The chance to fight would come again, and she'd know when it was the right time to take it. The goddess Andred would whisper it in her ear, and she'd be sure. For now, she'd bide her time, go about her duties, and say nothing. But the memory of her mother, her father, the village where she'd grown up, stayed with her like a constant ache. Each waking morning, she longed for her tribe. One day, she was sure her family would be together again. She spooned honey onto the pancake, singing quietly. Someone behind her said, "You're chirpy today, Brea. Don't let everyone know it. Galena will find even more work for us to do if she thinks we're too happy." Brea glanced at Daphne, a house slave around her own age, with dark hair and a bony frame. She smiled. "I've just made the master's breakfast. It'll keep him sweet today." "Old Alba Barber isn't the biggest problem," Daphne groaned. "He's an old goat now. Thank the gods for all the retired soldiers in Camulodunum. All they want is to doze, drink wine, and have someone oil their back in the baths. They won't cause us any trouble. Oh no, it's the younger ones that we need to watch." "He's a fair man, the master," Brea said. Publius Julius, with his white beard and his red-rimmed eyes, treated his slaves with an ambivalent lack of interest, as long as he could relax in the bath or sleep for most of the day. Being a slave in his house wasn't too arduous, unless rules were broken. The same could not be said for his daughter, Julia. It was best to work hard and avoid any confrontation. Daphne was chattering. I was talking to another slave at the marketplace the other day, and her mistress beats her every day. She has a terrible temper, apparently. She treats her poor slave so badly, calling her names. And her husband just looks on, as if nothing is happening. These women seem to enjoy making slaves' lives miserable, and some of the men are worse. They think their slave women are, you know, she lowered her voice, meretrices, prostitutes, simply for the taking. I wouldn't like to live like that. I'd better give the master his breakfast. Brea was never interested in slave gossip. She knew it could lead to being overheard and then beaten. Daphne picked up a bowl. I have fish to prepare for tonight's meal. It's just the master by himself for a few days. It's hard to persuade him to eat more than a morsel. If there's any left over, we can share it. But mark my words, the hard work will start soon enough. I can't say I'm looking forward to it. Why? What's amiss? Brea asked, hesitating. Are we expecting guests? Daphne beamed, putting the bowl down distractedly, delighted to be passing on news. The master's son, Marcellus, is on his way home, and there will be feasting. The gods have watched over him. Apparently he's taken a small kingdom from some wild Britons for Nero, although I don't know what it all means, to be honest. It certainly won't be of any use to us slaves. Whatever Nero gets, Nero keeps for himself. He's a nasty piece of work. They say the nice old Emperor Claudius was killed by his wife Agrippina so that she could crown her own son, Nero. What kingdom? Brea interrupted her. I don't know. It doesn't affect me. Daphne poured water into a jug. I'd better get on with my work. And the master's breakfast is getting cold. You'll save yourself a beating if you take it now. Brea hadn't moved. Her heart thumped. What kingdom has the master's son taken? Who cares? He's always off fighting some Briton tribe. I just pick up bits and pieces from what the master says when I pour his wine. Marcellus is coming back, and then there will be a big wedding. A bride's coming from Rome. She'll live here while her husband is away. Oh? Brea was still desperate to find out the name of the conquered kingdom, but Daphne wanted to talk about the new mistress. Old Alba Barber's daughter doesn't like the idea. The mistress Julia's furious. She's mean enough without having a rival for her brother's attention. But she'll be round here every opportunity she gets, ruling the roost, feasting with her husband and her father and her brother. She'll want to get to know his new wife, seek out her weak places. Brea was momentarily sad. I remember the master's son's first wife. I was sorry when she died in her childbed. That was years ago. A man has to marry again, especially one who is a legate in the Roman army. He's left it long enough. He must be 30 now, and he needs sons. Daphne arranged fruit in a dish. I wonder what the new mistress is like. She can't be any worse than Julia. She's a water snake if ever I met one. Brea caught Daphne's eye, a silent communication to keep her voice down. A tall woman walked into the kitchen, staring around with a stony face. Brea and Daphne immediately sprang into action. Brea spooning more honey onto the pancake, Daphne gouging at the fish. Galena pressed her lips together. I hope you're not gossiping. Not us. Daphne increased her efforts. Galena turned on Brea. There are vegetables to prepare. Brea lifted the pancake. I'm off to sweeten the master. Give old Whitebeard a kiss from me, and tell him there's a tasty fish or two for supper. Daphne cackled. I will. Brea was on her way, a smile on her face. Galena reached for 2 small fish in the bowl, grumbling. These should have been done already, Daphne. Brea fled for the steps. There was always a beating to be had when Galena was there. Many years older than the other women, She considered herself chief kitchen slave. Daphne was a good sort, though. She meant no harm. She'd always accepted Brea. Brea understood why. Not a day passed that she didn't whisper a prayer to Andred for her father and her mother. She hadn't heard any news of them since the Romans' attack on their village, yet each day she prayed silently to the warrior goddess, begging to see her parents once more. And if the worst had happened, if they were dead, Brea entreated Andred to allow her to find those who had killed them and avenge their lost lives. For now, she was a slave, but it wouldn't always be that way. Her first duty was as an Iceni daughter, and the chance would come. She was sure of it. She reached the triclinium, where Publius Julius was stretched languidly on a couch waiting for breakfast. He glanced in her direction. "Ah, Ancilla." He called all the slave women by that name. It meant slave and was deliberately impersonal. "You have my pancake? I hope it's smothered in honey." "It is." Brea deposited the food on the couch in front of him and turned to go. "Ancilla?" Publius Julius waved an arm. "I hadn't dismissed you." Brea turned back and glanced at her feet. She watched him, despite her head being down, as he pushed a piece of pancake into his mouth. He chewed for a while, and then he said, "Most delicious. Praise the goddess Ceres. The bounty of the earth and the fertility of the growing fields combine in this wonderful pancake. And dates, too. I am blessed indeed." "Master," Brea said quietly. She wanted to return to the Coulina, to help Daphne prepare the next meal. She was also thinking about going outside. It was a fine day. She could make an excuse to walk through the gardens and talk to Adidomarus. He was good company, and he understood her well. Unlike the slaves who had been shipped from Rome, Adidomarus had been brought to Camulodunum in the same way as Brea, after his people had been attacked. He'd always said he was lucky not to have been sent to build the temple of the divine Claudius, where he would have surely died from the hard work, as many had done. Brea suspected that was where her father had been taken. "Ancilla?" Publius Julius stopped chewing and wiped his beard on the long sleeve of his tunic. Brea knew she'd have to wash out another stain later. "Ancilla, I want you to take a message into Camulodunum." "Very well." Brea was secretly pleased. "I want you to ask Canipectus the potter to come here. I need him to make some special pots on his wheel for a great banquet." "I will." Brea recalled what Daphne had told her. "My son, Marcellus, is getting married. His wife will be here from Rome in a few days. I knew her father, Lucius Aurelius, a fine man, an excellent brain, and a great writer of satire, too." He glanced at Brea, not expecting her to have understood. "Go now, Ancilla. Tell Canipectus I wish to see him after lunch, and not to tarry. I wish to buy the finest pottery for my son's wedding, and only the best of everything will do." Publius Julius waved a hand. "What are you waiting for, Ancilla? Go!" "I am on my way," Brea said quickly, and was hurrying across the mosaic floor towards the atrium, a smile on her face. Being outside in Camulodunum was the nearest she came to freedom. Chapter 4. Brea found Adidomarus among a group of slaves working in the hortus, the walled garden of the villa that led to a vast orchard where he was tending ornamental plants. Nearby, a cherry tree was in flower, and Brea scooped up a handful of petals, holding them in front of her nose. "The scent is wonderful." "Lady Julia asked me to collect them. She wants them dried and placed in the bedrooms in her domus." Adidomarus was tall and lean. His dark hair had been shaved, but it had started to grow back, and his head was a mass of black prickles. She told me I should deliver them myself. She said I'd find her in the bedroom, and to come on a day when her husband was out. His face was unhappy. I think she likes to use young slave men as a cat does a mouse. I hear Julia isn't a dutiful wife. Brea kept her voice low. I shouldn't speak of it, but it worries me if she has set her sights on you. I'm afraid, too. I don't want anything to do with her, Adidamaris said. Her father and her husband are both powerful men. Just imagine what would happen. Then you mustn't go, Ade, Brea said. You're too busy. The master will not let you go. Tell her that. How can I tell her anything? She sees life as a game. Adidamaris sighed. I wish I was free to marry a good woman. We'd have the most peas, leeks, cucumbers, artichokes. His eyes shone at the thought of it. Do you think one day you'll buy your freedom? Maybe the master will give it freely, although it is not often that a master grants a slave liberty while he's still alive, and Whitebeard may live for 10 years more. I'm too useful here, Adidamaris said sadly. What about you, Brea? Do you dream of freedom, too? I'm sure it will happen one day. Brea's hand moved to her hip, as if an imaginary sword was there. I'll go home, back to my tribe, and search for my family. I'd find a village, speak to King Prasutagus, tell him what happened. Prasutagus is dead. Did you not hear? Adidamaris said quietly. In his will, he left instructions for his kingdom, half to be given to his 2 daughters, and half to Rome to appease the emperor. That's where the master's son has gone now. He's led an attack to take the Iceni lands. Brea moved closer to him. How do you know? There's been talk, but I do not want to speak of it to you, Brea. It's best not to know. Don't think of it again, for your own safety. Queen Boudicca won't allow her land to be taken. Brea couldn't help the sudden anger that flared. She'll find it hard to stand against the Roman army. Brea's hand clutched an imaginary sword. But half of it rightly belongs to the king's daughters. The Romans don't recognize that women can own land. These people are not like us. Most Roman women are the property of their fathers or husbands, while others, Adidamaris shuddered. Think of Julia. She takes lovers, goes to the amphitheatre, makes her husband look like a foolish old man when they are in company. Ade, we shouldn't talk. We might be overheard. They had already said too much. Brea looked around, changing the subject deliberately. The garden's exceedingly beautiful. You make it look and smell like a place where gods might live. Then one evening, when your tasks are completed, would you come here to walk with me for a while? I seldom finish before nightfall. Brea gave, I will. It is always pleasant to share your company. We could talk about the future, Adidamaris ventured. I don't think about it, Brea replied honestly. Now I must go. I have a message to take. Other slaves had noticed them talking together. Someone might report them. Soon, Brea was on her way into Camulodunum. As she hurried past the temple of the divine Claudius, she paused momentarily to look at the alabaster-smooth pillars, the tall stone steps. She could not read, but something had been engraved in beautiful letters beneath the roof. She took a deep breath, recalling how she had passed the temple many times when it was being built, pausing to hear the cry of slaves, the swish of whips, the harsh yell of the guards who urged the men to work harder, lifting stones, building pillars. Brea wondered again if one of the slaves might have been her father. She believed the Romans had brought him here to Camulodunum because he was a strong man. They would have thought him capable and dispensable. She'd always noticed the men as they bent over, their backs scarred and scourged, a simple loincloth to keep out the cold. She'd wanted to call out, "Father!" But there were so many fathers there. Would she have even recognised Esico? Would she recognise him if she met him now? She pushed the thought away. She would be reunited with her father one day. Her mother, too. She was sure of it. Brea walked onwards towards the potter's shop, passing the small theatre and the ludus gladiatorius, where the gladiators were trained. Brea had never seen a gladiator fight, although she had seen their trainer, a large man called Marcus Rubrius, who fed his men on barley, beans, and dried fruit. He carried a whip and a lucky charm, an image of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. Brea didn't like the way he looked at her. Even now she was scurrying down the road as quickly as possible, in case Marcus Rubrius came out to heckle and shout lewd words. Brea reached the potter's shop. Canepectus was a pleasant man, who sat calmly at his wheel, whistling happily to himself as his palms made beautiful smooth pots grow from between them. She liked to watch him work, but today she had an important message. "You need to visit my master, Publius Julius Silvanus, this afternoon." "Oh?" Canepectus lifted an eyebrow. "Do you know what he wants? Old Whitebeard expects things to be done before I've had chance to clean my wheel." "His son is getting married again." "I hadn't heard." Canepectus frowned. "I usually know everything that's going on in Camulodunum. I'm surprised, I must say. Marcellus Julius spends most of his time on the battlefield. Why does he need a wife?" He shrugged. "The usual reason, I suppose. To get sons. Someone in his line to leave everything to when he dies. But I never thought he'd marry. Not after the Lady Claudia." Brea remembered her, a slight woman who was so delicate that it seemed a strong breeze might blow her over. "There's a woman coming from Rome, the daughter of a friend of the master." "It's been arranged, then?" Claudia and Marcellus had known of each other since they were children. I can't see the new wife ever managing to edge herself into his favours. "Perhaps she'll be good-natured," Brea said hopefully. "A pleasant mistress means an easier life for all of us." "Then she'll be easily hurt," Canepectus shrugged. "The best thing would be for her to be self-centred, like Julia. They can keep each other happy trying to seduce noblemen or slaves when their husbands are drinking wine in their baths." He raised an eyebrow. "I hear Julia likes to watch the gladiators in the arena." Brea shook her head. "I feel sorry for those poor men, fighting for others' entertainment. A battle should be fierce and harsh, but it should be for the right reasons." Canepectus gave a short laugh. "You are Iceni. I forgot. The Roman ways must still be strange." "Not at all," Brea said quietly. "I understand them too well." "You lost your parents to the Romans?" Canepectus asked gently. "They aren't lost." Brea tilted her chin. "I haven't found them yet, that's all." Canepectus leaned forward, lifting his hands that were crusted in dried clay. "Did you know that I'm a Briton, from a long line of potters?" "I didn't know that, no. Many of the people in my village were potters, too." "I'll give you some advice," Canepectus said quietly. The Roman army is a rolling wave of destruction, and it will flatten everything that stands against it. But the Romans, their houses," he grinned, "the way they heat their rooms when the cold weather comes, it's not without merit. So my advice is," he took a breath, "forget your tribe. Let the past go. Instead, concentrate on pleasing your masters, and one day you'll get your freedom and live happily." He met her eyes. "That's all we can hope for." Perhaps some things are greater than life. Family, honour, love, Brea suggested. And what if we have more than one life? I believe the gods can bring us back again. My father told me. "The Romans would not like to hear you speak this way." The potter shook his head gravely. "Leave those notions in the past." He offered a warm smile. "Trust me, life will be easier if you embrace Rome. You're a woman. It is the same for you, whatever happens. You must bear the yoke of marriage or the yoke of slavery." Iceni women are not like Roman ones. We stand side by side, father, husband, wife, daughter. We are strongest together. Brea raised her chin defiantly. "Go now. Tell your master I'll come directly to talk about pots. I'll make fine pitchers, wine goblets in the curved shape of a woman, bowls deep as thirsty Roman throats. I will not fail him. And you," Canopectus said gently, "forget your Iceni ways." "Fare you well," Brea said quietly. Then she was gone from his shop. She hurried through the streets, past the ludus, where shouts of men clanging swords and fighting echoed loudly. She rushed by as quickly as she could, and was soon level with the temple of the divine Claudius. A beggar woman was huddled on the steps, her matted hair over her face like a mass of cobwebs. She held out a skinny hand. "Pray you, bring me food, and I will grant you a favour." "I have nothing," Brea said kindly. "I'm just a slave." "I'll be here later. Bring me something from your kitchen, or I'll be dead by morning. Come from your kulina with a morsel, and I'll have something for you, by the grace of the gods." The woman's eyes were glassy with hunger. "I will be on these temple steps, waiting." "I'll try my best," Brea promised. "You'll not be sorry. I have a gift that will change your days." The woman lifted a skinny finger and pressed it against Brea's cheek. "My name is Luna." "Then farewell, Luna." Brea rushed towards the villa. She had already been away too long. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the woman watching her, a bundle of tattered rags beneath tangled hair and glittering eyes. Brea hurried on. There would be a beating waiting for her from Galena back in the kitchen, but she'd find the chance and slip out again. The beggar woman had promised a gift that would change her life, and Brea was intrigued. Chapter 5. It was past 9 when Hanna woke. Although at first her sleep had been haunted by strange dreams, she sat up in bed feeling refreshed and energetic. She was home. She rushed to the window, flinging back the curtain. Below, a man was driving an enormous farm vehicle across a field. She stared harder. It was Paddy, and there was a black and white border collie sitting in the cab seat beside him. Hanna wondered if she ought to learn more about farm life, what each vehicle was for, when the time was for ploughing and harvesting, and what farmers did in between. Farming probably had a language all of its own. Then there were all those pigs. Hanna smiled. Her mother was adapting well to the new way of life, so perhaps Hanna could too. Fleetingly, she remembered it was Friday. She decided to hurry downstairs and see what her mother was doing. She could smell cooking. Stephanie was standing at the Aga poaching eggs and pouring coffee. Hanna sat down at the table. "I don't usually have breakfast, Mum." "What? Not at all?" "Not really. I never have time." Stephanie smiled fondly. "You have time now. So, 2 eggs or 3? "One's enough," Hanna gasped. "And 1 piece of toast." "I'll cook 2. You're living on a farm now, and my chickens lay the best eggs. You'll taste the difference." Stephanie turned her back, waving a spoon. "And I make all my own bread." "You must adore living here, Mum." Hanna loved how her mother appeared to be queen of the kitchen, creating breakfast as if she was making magic. Stephanie agreed. "I'm sure you'll settle in." She indicated the coffee, and Hanna took a sip. I think I will." Stephanie's eyes softened. "Is it good to be back?" She placed a plate of toast and 2 perfectly poached eggs in front of Hanna. "I hope it feels like home." "It's wonderful," Hanna said. "It will be lovely to have some time to work out what to do next. There may be jobs in the schools in King's Lynn. They are always looking for languages teachers." "Maybe." Hanna nodded, her mouth full. "Or you said you might go back to uni and do a master's." "It feels so nice to have choices, Mum." Hanna was suddenly filled with new enthusiasm. "I've always been interested in jewellery. I could take a course and learn to design it." "That sounds like fun." "Or I could just work on the farm," Hanna teased. "Oh, I'm not sure Paddy and Oliver need—" Stephanie realised the joke. "Ah, yes, you could help Paddy with all those lovely smelly pigs." She sat down opposite Hanna, cradling a cup between her palms. "You can stay here as long as you like. Something is sure to come along and grab your interest, and you'll be off like a tornado again. But perhaps you'll stay this time." "You mean find the one and settle down?" Hanna grinned, tucking into the 2nd egg. "Maybe when I'm your age, Mum. That might be soon enough." "You don't think I've been a bad influence?" Stephanie's expression changed to one of anxiety. "I mean, I brought you up by myself. There was never a man in the house. Even when I was married to your father, he was always away. We were just like friends, Hanna, not mother and daughter. We went everywhere together. And I sometimes worry that I made you too independent." "No one can be too independent." Hanna squeezed her mother's hand across the table. "You're the best, Mum. You always have been." "But you had no father figure, and now—" Stephanie sighed. "You don't seem to want a partner." "You're right." Hanna pushed her plate away, along with the idea. "You know there have been boyfriends along the way. But I've never looked to settle for one in particular. I suppose I've never found anyone who interests me enough." "It happens when it happens," Stephanie said philosophically. "I mean, I'm 59, and it's taken this long for me to find Mr. Right." Hanna grinned.